All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to another installment of the comprehensive yet informal study of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. It's Patrick and I today here, and we're starting a new section, or a whole new chapter of the Transcendental Analytic that's called "On the Deduction of the Pure Concepts of the Understanding." We got some tables before of some concepts. Of the understanding. So now we're gonna be exploring the deduction of those concepts. And yeah, this is just kind of I was just gonna explain to Patrick before we started recording. This is uh, just kind of like a new thing. Now obviously it's related to what we did before, but it's not like we're in the middle of a section and continuing. This is gonna be some new content we're gonna get here with new vocabulary and new conceptual things going on. So yeah, it's good that we're starting with a new thing like this as well because it has been definitely a few weeks since we've done the last one. So we may have to like pause and go back and look for some detail in case we forget something, but hopefully not. I think it'll be pretty smooth. And yeah, unless Patrick has any notes to begin us with, we can get into it and start reading.
Nope, no additional notes from me.
All right. Since you're on the screen share, does that make it weird for you to read, or are you still okay with reading? I could just read everything if it's weird for you, but
I can read.
okay, cool. Do you want to start us off then?
Well, I have a question. Are we
Oh yes.
reading this note here?
No, because that this is just like I don't think it's very relevant. This is kind of just talking
I
about.
think probably the consciousness and inner sense section here down there might be good.
Follow me notes. Oh yes,
So
yes, yes. Okay, these.
I'll read
Sorry,
that one.
I thought you meant like this big paragraph.
But
Yeah.
no, not that big one. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, yes. These
Okay.
actually, you're right. I think these are good.
So
So
I'll
let's just
start
start with
then.
these. Yes. Okay. Sounds good.
So, first section on the principles of the transcendental deduction in general. Jurists, when they speak of entitlements and claims, distinguish in a legal matter between what is lawful quid juris and, let me finish the sentence at least,
Okay.
that which concerns the fact, quid facti. Honestly, I'm going to call that a sentence because that should have been a sentence. Back up.
Okay. Sounds good.
um, the following notes are inserted here in Kant's copy of the first edition. Consciousness and inner sense are different. What is that in relation to? I think is a
Each other?
spontaneity. Like what is that? I can't read what the note is in relation to.
Oh. This is to the C, which is just at the very beginning of like right before jurists. There's a footnote C.
Okay,
So maybe we should have
consciousness
read that first, but it's
and
okay.
inner sense are different. I think is spontaneity and does not depend on any object. The representation, however, with which I think must be given to me antecedently in intuition through imagination. With regard to it, I am affected. It must be proved that if there were no sensible intuition a priori, and if this were not the form of sensibility in the subject, with which all appearances must be in accord, then no categories would have significance, and from mere categories, no synthetic a priori propositions would be possible. All right, I'm confused.
Okay, we can tackle this in bits. We can start with the first
So
one. I think this is
this I think makes sense to me.
yes, that
Consciousness
does.
and
I was gonna relate it to the very beginning of, I think it's like the first sentence that we started with in this study, where it says like something like that it can be said without a doubt that all knowledge begins with experience, but this does not follow that it arises from experience. I think that's
right,
kind of just like an elaboration of that. Like I
right.
think is spontaneity, but to actually like register that as a representation, as like a subjective inner sense representation, you need to have the experience of the intuition. So
Yes, that makes sense.
yes,
But then the next part, it must be proved. Oh, does this note relate to D?
no, that's still on C. D is just this Voss, which is the German stuff.
Okay, so I guess it must be proved. So what is he trying to prove here, right? He's talking about jury, he's talking about entitlements and claim.
Mm-hmm.
What is lawful and what is the fact? So I guess that's related to it must be proved that if there were no sensible intuition a priori, and if this were not the form of sensibility in the subject. Okay, so in other words, if empiricism is true against Kant's claims,
Mm-hmm.
um, with which appearances must be in accord with, then no categories would have significance, and from mere categories, no synthetic a priori propositions at all would be possible. Okay, so he's basically saying he has to prove, in order for us to accept these a priori sensibility conditions, right, he has to prove that categories would not have significance and synthetic a priori propositions would not be possible.
Yes, he's basically trying to show
That
yeah,
without a system, we would arrive at absurdities.
yeah.
All
Reductio ad
right,
absurdum. That's what I was searching for. If that's
yeah.
the yep.
Let's continue then from what is lawful and
What is
what
fact?
concerns fact, quid facti.
Okay.
And since they demand proof of both, they call the first, which is to establish the entitlement or the legal claim, the deduction. Okay. What is lawful is the deduction.
Mm-hmm.
We make use of a multitude of empirical concepts without objection from anyone, and take ourselves to be justified in granting them a sense of supposed signification, even without any deduction, because we always have experience ready at hand to prove their objective reality. But there are also concepts that have been usurped, such as fortune and fate, which circulate with almost universal indulgence, but are occasionally called upon to establish their claim by the question quid juris. And then there is not a little embarrassment about their deduction because no one can adduce a clear legal ground for an entitlement for their use, either from experience or from reason.
Hmm.
Okay, so we're in the deduction, right?
Yeah.
So he's talking about the lawful um, proof of what here? Concepts? Yes. I
Mm-hmm.
see. So he has to deduce the categories not from what actually has occurred, because of
No.
course we do
Yeah.
use the
Empty
categories
concepts.
in actual fact. Like we actually use the concept, say, of unity or of plurality, right? Or of substance. But how do we do that lawfully with regards to legal claim is the question, it seems to be.
Um. I think he was
Like,
just drawing. I think he was just drawing an analogy. I don't know if he's actually like going into a legal like
well, when I say
inquiry.
lawfully, I mean like in
Oh.
accordance with rule,
Okay. Gotcha. Sorry, I thought you were. Okay.
not
Yes.
like,
Yes. That makes sense.
yeah. Okay.
Yes. I think yeah that makes sense.
All right. Would you like to pick it up?
Sure. Among the many concepts, however, that constitute the very mixed fabric of human cognition, there are some that are also destined for pure use a priori, completely independently of all experience, and these always require a deduction of their entitlement, since proofs from experience are not sufficient for having the lawfulness, there's that word, of such a use, and yet one must know how to use these concepts can or shoot and one must know how these concepts can be related to objects that they do not derive from any experience. I therefore call the explanation of the way in which concepts can relate to objects a priori their transcendental deduction, and distinguish from this the empirical deduction, which shows how a concept is acquired through experience and a reflection on it, and therefore concerns not the lawfulness, but the fact from which the possession has arisen. Okay, so we have two different types of deduction here, the transcendental deduction and the empirical deduction. And the transcendental deduction, Kant is arguing that there is an a priori way in which concepts are derived, because, especially as we saw in that footnote, he's trying to argue here against, like David Hume or just kind of any really empiricist view, which would probably hold only the empirical deduction like actually happens, right? In terms of like how knowledge is gained and how judgments are formed and all that. Kant's gonna try to argue for something further, which is the transcendental deduction, which is something a priori, right? It's independent of experience. In terms of how the categories like are in his language deduced.
Right. So in the metaphor, empirical would be quid facti, and transcendental would be quid juris. But
Yes.
I actually think this is a kind of crappy analogy
Okay.
in that, um, in order to establish, for instance, a crime in a
Mm-hmm.
legal proceeding, you need to, for the same matter, take both the empirical quid facti and the legal, right? What happened and was it legal? Whereas here, it's two entirely different methods of arriving at the same information. It's a question of different information with the law.
Yes. Um, yeah. So it's a little.
It's a little shady.
Yeah. It's. I think it's more of just like a surface level kind of like okay. So we have things that happened, and we have these like concepts that we deduced that aren't dependent upon what actually happened. Even though like Patrick's saying, they do work uh, differently when the process is actually carried out. I think Kant is more so just trying to highlight a conceptual difference that doesn't actually encompass the full uh, legal process. um,
It actually confused me the first time around.
yeah, yeah. When I first read it too, I was like, "What the heck?" Um, Also, Patrick, I don't know if you something you could do your microphone. Just now, you started getting a little like uh, crungly. You like your audio? Um,
Is this better?
oh yes, that's much better. Thank you. Cool. All right. Well, in that case, do you want to pick up the next paragraph?
Sure. Okay. Okay. Now we already have two sorts of concepts of an entirely different kind, which yet agree with each other in that they both relate to objects completely a priori, namely the concepts of space and time as forms of sensibility, and the categories as concepts of the understanding. Right. So he's talking not about space and time, which are intuitions, but about the concept of space and the concept of time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
To seek an empirical deduction of them would be entirely futile work, for what is distinctive in their nature is precisely that they are related to their objects without having borrowed anything from experience for their representation. Thus, if a deduction of them is necessary, it must always be transcendental.
Okay, that's very straightforward. He's just kind of
Uh,
saying if it's not empirical, it's stupid to try to do an empirical deduction.
I suppose so. If we mean deduction in the sense of in accordance with the law, yes.
Yeah.
But if you want to show that they are in fact used by some this or that empirical claim, then that would work. But that just wouldn't be a deduction, properly speaking, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Okay.
All
Cool.
right, that's pretty short. I'll keep going.
Yes.
Nevertheless, in the case of these concepts, as in the case of all cognition, we can search and experience, if not for the principle of their possibility, then for the occasional causes of their generation. Yeah, that's pretty much what I was just talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Uh, where the impressions of the senses provide the first occasion for opening the
Entire power.
entire power of cognition to them, and for bringing about experience, which contains two very heterogeneous elements, namely a matter for cognition from the senses and a certain form for ordering it from the inner source of pure intuiting and thinking, which on the occasion of the former are first brought into use and bring forth concepts. Such A tracing of the first endeavors of our power of cognition to extend from individual perceptions to general concepts is without a doubt of great utility, and the famous Locke is to be thanked for having first opened the way for this. Yet a deduction of pure a priori concepts can never be achieved in this way. It does not lie down this path at all. For in regard to their future use, which should be entirely independent of experience and entirely different uh, per certificate than that of an ancestry from experiences must be produced. I will therefore call this attempted physiological,
Physiological. Yeah.
okay, physiological derivation, which cannot properly be called a deduction at all because it concerns a quaesitio facti, the explanation of the possession of a pure cognition. It is therefore clear from only a transcendental and never empirical deduction of them can be given. And that in regard to pure a priori concepts, only empirical deductions, uh, in regard to pure a priori concepts, empirical deductions are nothing but idle attempts which can only occupy those who have not grasped the entirely distinctive nature of these cognitions.
All right. Big wall of text there, but we
I
can
mean,
break
he's
it down.
talking just about like what the empirical um, quote unquote deduction would be, and he says it wouldn't really be a deduction.
Deduction, yeah.
It would be an explanation of the possession of pure cognition. It's what Locke did. You just explain how those concepts come into use actually in terms of like empirical experience. But as Kant says, that doesn't actually
Answer the
address the
question.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense to me.
Yes. Okay. Cool. I'll read the next big paragraph. Oh, it's pretty big. That's okay. All right. But now, even if the sole manner of a possible deduction of pure a priori cognition is conceded, namely that which takes the transcendental path, it is still not obvious that it is of unavoidably necessary. So that's kind of interesting here. I guess he's implying that it is possible to have an a priori deduction of cognition that isn't transcendental. I don't exactly know what that would be, but maybe not that important. And then he says that it's not obvious that it's unavoidably necessary, so I'm guessing he's going to show that next. We have above traced the concepts of space and time to their sources by means of a transcendental deduction, and explained and determined their a priori objective validity. Geometry nevertheless follows its secure course through strictly a priori cognitions, without having to beg philosophy for any certification of the pure and lawful pedigree of its fundamental concept of space. Um, yeah, so this is kind of like you don't need to be a philosopher to be a mathematician. You can still follow its a priori cognitions without really understanding its origin.
Well, he seems to be saying, yes, if we were going to derive um, the categories, it has to be through a transcendental deduction. But it's not clear yet that we do need to derive the categories, in fact.
Right, and then he gives us example of what I just said. Cool. Um, so let's see if it is unavoidably necessary. My guess is yes, but we'll see. Yet, the use of the concept in this science concerns only the external world of the senses, of which space and time is the pure form of its intuition, and in which, therefore, all geometrical cognition is immediately evident because it is grounded on intuition a priori, and the objects are given through the cognition itself a priori in intuition as far as their form is concerned. With the pure concepts of the understanding, however, there first arises the unavoidable need to search for the transcendental deduction not only for them, or not only of them, sorry, but also of space, for since they speak of objects not through predicates of intuition and sensibility, but through those of pure a priori thinking, they relate to objects generally without any conditions of sensibility. And since they are not grounded in experience and cannot exhibit any object in a priori intuition on which to ground their synthesis prior to any experience, They not only arouse suspicion about the objective validity and limits of their use, but also make the concept of space ambiguous by inclining us to use it beyond the conditions of sensible intuition, on which account a transcendental deduction of it was also needed above. Thus, the reader must be convinced of the unavoidable necessity of such a transcendental deduction before he has taken a single step into the field of pure reason, for he would otherwise proceed blindly, and after much wandering around, would still have to return to the ignorance from which he had begun. Okay, so now we have our answer as to. So I was correct. It is necessary, unavoidably so. Why is this the case? Because we can't really appeal to anything else to which we can say that these concepts are valid. Um, and if we do that, what will happen is that suspicion will be aroused about the objective validity and limits of their use. Um, and the concept of space is made ambiguous. He says here, by inclining us to use it beyond the conditions of sensible intuition. So I'm guessing like this is like making claims about like I don't know. I mean, this is directly like said here, but like I'm guessing this could be used for like some like proofs of God that he'll go on to
So basically, it's the
like
origin of philosophy itself, right?
yeah.
So it's um um how would I put it? He's basically saying, as long as we are just looking at space and time, right, mathematical propositions, no one feels the need to question how it is that we can possibly know have a concept of space, have a concept of time.
Mm-hmm.
But once we venture outside of them, the categories themselves sort of create this need for philosophy, um, because they don't deal directly with particular intuitable experiences like those you would see in mathematics. And
Yeah,
so
that's what I
they're
was trying to
using
say
them.
before. There's like no ground to latch onto, like
Yeah,
conceptually, for us to even like be like, okay, like here's how this works. It's kind of just them themselves, like because it's so foundational. I think it's there. You just have to kind of like Patrick just said. And Kant just said it necessarily follows because that there's nothing else to kind of you. There's no instances of it. It just kind of is what it is. You have to look into it. That makes
gotcha.
sense.
Okay.
Cool. Um,
In the case of the concepts of space and time, we were able to make comprehensible with little effort how these, as a priori cognitions, must nevertheless necessarily relate to objects, and made possible a synthetic cognition of them independent of all experience. For since an object can appear to us only by means of such pure forms of sensibilities, i.e., an object of empirical intuition, space and time are thus pure intuitions that contain a priori the conditions of the possibility of objects as appearances, and the synthesis in them has objective validity. So he's just talking basically about why it was so easy to do the transcendental aesthetic.
yes, it was very yeah the it was very obvious how they related, like the concepts related to uh, their intuitions and made possible synthetic cognition. Yeah, that was very straightforward. And if you don't know what we're talking about, go back towards the beginning of the study where we covered the transcendental aesthetic, and you'll see exactly what he's talking about here. Uh,
Yeah.
cool.
The categories of the understanding, on the contrary, do not represent to us the conditions under which the objects are given an intuition at all. Hence, objects can indeed appear to us without necessarily having to be related to functions of the understanding, and therefore without the understanding containing their a priori cognition conditions. Thus, a difficulty is revealed in that we do not encounter in the field of sensibility that we did not encounter in the field of sensibility, namely, how the subjective conditions of thinking should have objective validity, i.e., yield conditions for the possibility of all cognition of objects. 4. Appearances can certainly be given in intuition without the function of the understanding. I take, e.g., the concept of cause, which signifies a particular kind of synthesis in which, given something a priori, something entirely different b is posited according to a rule. It is not clear a priori why appearances should contain anything of this sort. One cannot deduce experiences for the proof, for the objective validity of this. A priori concept must be able to be demonstrated. And it is therefore a priori doubtful whether such a concept is not perhaps entirely empty and finds no object anywhere among the appearances. For that, objects of sensible intuition must accord with the formal conditions of sensibility that lie in the mind a priori is clear from the fact that otherwise they would not be objects for us, but that they must accord with the condition that the understanding requires for the synthetic unity of thinking that is a conclusion that is not so easily seen. For appearances could after all be so constituted that the understanding would not find them in accord with conditions of its unity, and everything would then lie in such confusion, e.g., in the succession of appearances, nothing would offer itself that would furnish a rule of synthesis, and thus correspond to the concept of cause and effect. So that this concept would therefore be entirely empty, nugatory, and without significance. Appearances would nonetheless offer objects for intuition, for intuition by no means requires the functions of thinking.
Yeah, so he's just basically saying here that we have a lot more work to do for the reasons that he said in the previous paragraph, right? We don't really have anything just to easily tie together. It is not clear that these concepts are actually, what he says here, have objective validity, right? They could just be subjective conditions of thinking and not actually affect how the objective world works at all. We could have all these useless, empty concepts in our head, and that be that, and then be totally maybe in some like Cartesian way deceived right by them, and this is the brings up cause and effect, and this is kind of what David Hume pointed out, right? There's a difference between the subjective conditions of thinking and what actually goes on in the objective world.
Right.
Using this language, so we have to do some extra work to show that subjective conditions of thinking, for example, cause and effect, actually relate to the objective world and isn't just something that we're conjuring up using concepts that uh, spontaneously arise in our heads. So we have some work to do. That's basically what he's saying. So I'm guessing he's going to get into that next. Is there anything you think I missed in that analysis?
No, I think he was pretty much repeating himself.
Yeah, I was thinking that. This is kind of like a repetition of like previous paragraphs. So, all right, great. Well, that's not great maybe in itself. Maybe it is if you were confused and now you're not. But either way, we are moving on now. Do you want to read the next paragraph, or do you want me to
I
keep
just
going?
read that.
Hmm?
I just read that one.
Oh, you did. Oh, okay. I was just talking for so much that I guess I
You
forgot
forgot
who.
how you
Yeah. Lol. Okay. I will continue then. And this is the last paragraph I have planned for this. Let me just double check that. Yeah, okay. This is the last paragraph I have planned for this session. So hopefully this is a decently long one and not too short. The main reason why I have this as the last one is because after here, there's a split between the A and B versions of Critique of Pure Reason, and that will get really confusing if we don't pick one and go with it. So I have to talk to Patrick to see after this how we want to proceed. But yeah, so that's just a little heads up. So next time you'll see which edition we ended up choosing, and we'll probably explain why we chose that one and that there are differences and all that. Okay, but to wrap up this session and this first part of the first section of the new chapter, If one were to think of escaping from the toils of these investigations by saying that experience constantly offers examples of irregularity of appearances that give sufficient occasion for abstracting the concept of cause from them, and thereby at the same time thought to confirm the objective validity of such a concept, that one has then one has not noticed that the concept of cause cannot arise in this way at all, but must either be grounded in the understanding completely a priori, or else be entirely surrendered as a mere fantasy of the brain. So this basically just sums up what this sums up my summary of the previous paragraph. So this is even more repetition, I think. But that hopefully that just drives home the big point he's making here, that there's a very big difference between subjective conjuring of concepts and objective validity. Okay, and then he says, for this concept always requires that something A be of such kind that something else B follows from it necessarily and in accordance with an absolutely universal rule. Appearances may well offer cases from which a rule is possible in accordance with which something usually happens, but never a rule in accordance with which the succession is necessary. Thus, to the synthesis of cause and effect there attaches a dignity that can never be expressed empirically, namely that the effect does not merely come along without the cause, but is posited through it and follows from it. So yeah, he's pointing out here that it cannot be expressed empirically. That there's a necessity that needs to come from something non-empirical and a priori for it to be valid. The strict universality of the rule is therefore not any property of empirical rules, which cannot acquire anything more through induction than comparative universality, i.e., widespread usefulness. But now the use of the pure concept of the understanding would be entirely altered if one were to treat them only as empirical products. I just think that was more repetition or just straightforward things. Do you have anything to add to that ending there, Patrick? Or just this paragraph in general?
Really?
Yeah, me neither.
He's pretty repetitive here.
Yep. But hopefully at least then that makes it clear. Of course, if there are any questions, please follow up with us in the comments or anywhere else you can get in touch with us if you find some other way somehow. Yeah, so that was that first section of this second chapter of the Transcendental Analytic. Pretty straightforward. We need to do some work to show that things are...
that the concepts apply to experience necessarily.
Yes. So we'll go into that next time, and we will, as I said earlier, be picking an addition to follow from, or maybe we'll do a mix of both. I don't know. I'm going to talk to Patrick about that off camera, and you will see the decision and hopefully to the reasoning behind which, in case we skip some stuff but maybe it's important, we'll just let you know, and we'll go on for the sake of our study with one thing or the other. So we'll find that out next time. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next edition of the comprehensive yet informal study of Critique of Pure Reason.